As the chairman has announced, I'm going to deal with prices and inflation, and I want to give you a reminder here. This is quite a difficult subject, that in last week's talk and this one, I'm endeavouring to summarise about 150 pages of the first 4 chapters of Capital, and obviously you can't go into all the detail, and all we can hope is that what I'm saying here may help you to work your way through Capital and understand things a bit better, and also, of course, it will do the very important thing of relating the theory to the facts of life as you know them as workers. Well, last week I dealt with commodities and their value, including the labour power commodity, which the worker sells for his wage or salary. I also dealt with the way the worker produces surplus value for the capitalist through his unpaid labour. This week I'm dealing with the relationship of value to price and the part played by money, which naturally, of course, leads on to what is called inflation. Well, just as a recapitulation, we saw last week how the values of different kinds of commodities, as the articles you see sold in shops, are related to each other through the concept of value, Marx's labour theory of value, according to the amount of labour needed to produce them. In other words, if it takes 5 hours to produce a chair and 10 hours to produce a table, then the value of a table will be equal to the value of 2 chairs, and the value of one table will be equal to one table will be equal to 2 chairs. Having got this conception, you can relate all commodities to each other, because all commodities, that is to say, all the things that are ordinarily produced and reproduced in industry, are all the products of labour applied to nature-given materials, so they all have values. And on the basis of equal values, you can say that one table equals 2 chairs, equals a pair of shoes, half a ton of coal, so on, going through the whole of the range of the things that are produced. Now, this applies equally to the precious metals such as silver and gold. In the course of the development of the market, people, instead of going in for barter, came to use the precious metals as something that they could exchange for everything. And also, by general agreement, the world gradually settled mainly on gold, so I shall speak in terms of gold as the thing that really has mattered all the way through capitalism, or at least in the later stages of it, and which matters now. What you have to remember is that it is not gold which gives value to other commodities. Gold can operate as what Marx called the universal equivalent for all other commodities, only because gold and everything else, the tables and chairs and suits of clothing and so on, are all of them the products of value, of labour. That is to say, they're all embodiments of value and can be related to each other. So, if I may restate it, if a half an ounce of gold, half an ounce weight of gold, takes 10 hours labour, and the table takes 10 hours, and 2 chairs takes 10 hours, and so on, you can say, from a value point of view, half an ounce of gold equals 1 table, 2 chairs, pair of shoes, half a ton of coal, and so on. Gold is thus the equivalent of a value expressed in all commodities, and gold came to be used, as I say, as the universal equivalent for everything else. Now, going back a little, if you think of all the articles that are sold being the product of labour and embodying a certain number of hours of labour, you have to remember that while there is a sort of more or less permanent relationship between the values of different articles, those values can in fact change. It is possible for the value of a particular commodity to fall. If, for example, owing to inventions and discoveries, it becomes possible for an industry to become more efficient and reduce the amount of labour required to produce an article, then the value of those articles will fall. If it became possible to produce a table in 5 hours instead of 10 hours, then the value of the table would fall to a half. And if that happened, and if other commodities remained unchanged, then a table would equal the value of only 1 chair instead of 2 chairs. I mean, this is all, so to speak, simple arithmetical changes. But you also have to remember that the values of commodities can rise as well as fall. In some industries, the trend is not for the values of commodities to fall, but on the whole, it's the trend for the values to rise. And this chiefly affects what are called the extractive industries, the mines, places where coal and metallic ores and so on are mined. And the reason is a fairly simple one. The early mining operations worked on rich seams of coal or copper or whatever it was near the surface, and it therefore required relatively little labour to produce a ton of coal or a ton of metallic ore. But as these rich seams become exhausted, the mines have to go deeper and deeper, requiring more and more labour to produce the same amount of coal or whatever else it may be. So that in these cases, the value of the commodity is rising because it takes more labour to produce a ton than it used to. Usually in these extractive industries, you've got two factors operating, pushing in opposite directions. You've got the mines becoming deeper and therefore more labour being required to produce a ton of coal, but at the same time, the methods of mining are being perfected and becoming more efficient. So you've got two things pulling in opposite directions, and an official of the Coal Board dealing with this a few years ago used the phrase, he said, we have to run faster and faster to stay where we are. In other words, what he was saying is we have to go deeper and deeper in the mines, but we're using more efficient methods of doing it, and the two things are operating against each other, and so to speak, we have to run faster to maintain the output of the coal mines in relation to each ton that they produced. So you've got this thing that the value of a commodity can rise and the price of a commodity can rise. And the price of a commodity can also fall. Now I shall deal later with the reason why you hardly ever see in your newspapers anything about the price of commodities falling. Almost every day you'll see the price of something going up, but you rarely ever see anything about the price of things going down, and I'll deal with that later. Now you also have to remember that this universal equivalent gold, which is used as the basis of exchanging all other commodities, the value of gold also can alter. Just like coal mining, it could be possible for more and more labour to produce an ounce of gold because the mines are getting deeper. Alternatively, you might get a lot of new, rich gold mines discovered, requiring less labour to produce an ounce of gold, and in the course of history, both things have operated. But sometimes the value of gold has been falling, and sometimes the value of gold has been rising. But now let us take, first of all, the case of the value of gold falling. Suppose gold mining became more efficient, so that only 5 hours of labour were required to produce half an ounce of gold instead of 10 hours for half an ounce of gold. And suppose that the value of all other commodities remains unchanged, then a half an ounce of gold, instead of equaling 2 chairs, that is 10 hours, equals only 1 chair, that is 5 hours. This is because the value of gold now corresponds to 5 hours for a half an ounce, falling to 5 hours from 10 hours. So the value of gold has fallen. But the value of chairs has remained unchanged, so you now have 5 hours labour for 1 chair, 10 hours for 2 chairs. But you will also see, looking at it from the other way round, that whereas 1 chair used to equate with 1/4 of an ounce of gold, that is when 2 chairs equaled half an ounce, 1 chair now equates with half an ounce of gold. And it's important, you want to think about this, it's important that you understand this and remember it, because what you have got is that the reality of what's going on and the appearance of what's going on are not the same. The reality of a fall of gold is that the value of gold comes down, but it always shows itself in the appearance of a rise in the relative value of all other commodities. In other words, you've got a sort of upside-down relationship. If the value of gold falls, it shows itself as a rise in the relative value of everything else. And if the value of gold rises, it shows itself in a fall of the relative value of everything else. Now, the next stage you want to get into your minds, you've got to translate weights of gold into money. See, right up to this point, I've talked all the time about half ounces of gold in relation to the amount of labour to produce chairs and so on. But historically, as the market developed, you got rid of weights of gold and you put in their place coins. This was a historical process. It was obviously more convenient for traders and governments and bankers to deal in coins, that's pounds, dollars, francs, marks, and so on, instead of dealing with weights of gold. When they dealt in weights, of course, they had to weigh the stuff. When the government or the central bank started issuing coins of a guaranteed weight and fineness, you now got coinage doing away with the necessity of bankers and traders actually having to weigh the stuff and test its fineness. They now dealt in coins because the weight and the fineness of a coin was guaranteed by the government or whatever authority was issuing them. But you do have to notice this, that when gold coins were in general circulation, they were called sovereigns or dollars, but you were still dealing with weights of gold. You see, instead of dealing with half an ounce of gold, you now deal with a coin which is guaranteed by the government to contain a certain weight of gold, whether it's a dollar, a franc, or a mark, or whatever it was. So you're still dealing with weights of gold, although it's now has the name of a coin, and therefore you're still dealing with embodiments of value, that is, the hours of labor required to produce a given weight. Now, for various reasons, the authorities in different countries fixed on different weights of gold for their different coinage. In England, the pound, or the gold sovereign, as it was called, was fixed at approximately 1/4 of an ounce weight of gold. So an ounce of gold would be coined into 4 pounds approximately. And when I say approximately, I don't mean that it varied. It was actually fixed at 123 grains of pure gold, which is not quite 1/4 of an ounce. But I mean, for near enough, if you think of the old pound, the gold sovereign, as being 1/4 of an ounce weight of gold. The American dollar was fixed as a much smaller quantity of gold, so that $4.86 equaled 1 pound, and all that meant was that the amount of gold in an American dollar was a little over 1/5 of the amount of gold in an English sovereign. And remember still that the reality behind this was that gold was a commodity having value, and its value determined the relationship between a given weight of gold and the appropriate quantity of every other commodity. You're still dealing with value, you're still dealing with hours of labor, but the weights of gold have now been transformed into coins of guaranteed weight and purity. Now, going back to the earlier examples I've given you, we can now say that 4 pounds, that is 4 sovereigns or 80 shillings, represented about 1 ounce weight of gold, and therefore had the same value as any other commodity, representing 20 hours of labor. You remember I said half an ounce of gold, 10 hours. So an ounce weight of gold would be twice as much, so there'd be 20 hours of labor. So an ounce weight of gold, that is coined into 4 sovereigns, would be equal in value to 2 tables or 4 chairs or 1 ton of coal. So we can now talk in terms of money, that is price. We can say that 4 sovereigns, or 80 shillings, equaling 20 hours labour, because it was 1 ounce weight of gold, was equal to 2 tables, and therefore the 2 tables would have a price of 4 pounds, so the price of 1 table would be 2 pounds. Or the 80 shillings, the 4 sovereigns, would be equal to 4 chairs, so the price of 1 chair would be 1 pound. And the 80 shillings, the 4 pounds, were equal to 1 ton of coal, so the price of a ton of coal would be 4 pounds on that basis. You'll remember that I said there is this sort of upside-down relationship between the universal equivalent and the value of all other commodities. In other words, if the value of gold falls, it shows itself as a rise in the value of other commodities relatively, and the rise shows itself as a fall. This also applies, of course, to money. And you will find Marx using the expression, it's on page 88 of the Allen and Unwin edition in chapter 3, that money reads all prices backwards. And if you want an example, that will bring this home to you, it's in the sort of thing that you're becoming more and more used to nowadays. When the general price level starts to rise, people think of it merely as a rise of prices. Now that it's been going on in this country for about 30 years continuously, people are getting used to it, and they're now turning the thing round, and they're recognizing that you've got two things. You've got a rise of prices and a fall in the value of money, but of course they're merely the same two aspects of the same thing. That a rise of prices is a fall in the value of money, and a fall prices is a rise in the value of money. For example, a 100% rise in prices is equal to a 50% fall in the value of money. And if you just look at this and work it out, you'll see that you mustn't fall into the mistake of thinking that a 100% rise in prices is a 100% fall in the value of money, because a 100% fall in the value of money would be nothing. A 100% rise in prices is a 50% fall in the value of money. You will recall, incidentally, a well-known politician who stated when the pound was devalued that it didn't devalue the pound in your pocket. Well, as in fact, of course, devaluation did raise prices, and as a rise in prices is the opposite aspect of a fall in the value of money, you will see that in spite of what he said, the value of money was being depreciated, whether it was in your pocket or anywhere else. I'm now coming on to the application of this, and that is inflation. Having gone through the basic theories about value and price, we can now apply them to the real world and look at this problem of what is called inflation. But here I have to give you a word of warning about the use of terms. There are, in fact, several reasons why the price of an article can alter. I've already mentioned some of these. In a boom, for example, prices rise. In a slump, prices fall. And I've mentioned to you the other thing, that the price can rise or fall because the value alters. And I also mentioned to you earlier on last week that if somebody has a monopoly, he can put up prices. And alternatively, if a government likes to subsidize certain articles, they can put them on the market at below the ordinary price. So you can have here again, you can have various reasons why prices and values are not the same. But by an unfortunate piece of muddle, it has now become popular to use the word inflation as if it covered everything. Any change in prices now is called inflation. Well, this used not to be so. 30, 40, 50, 100 years ago, it was general practice to keep the word inflation to one precise meaning, that was a depreciation in the value of money, and not these other things. And so when I'm talking about inflation from now on, I'm talking about that general rise in prices that is due to the depreciation in the value of money, and not these other various things that can also happen. We now have to come on to another stage in this business of understanding how capitalism actually works in the market. We've got to consider how much currency, that is notes and coin, are required to carry on the business of buying and selling. And the first idea you've got to grasp in market operations is that given us a certain volume of transactions going on at a certain price level, you will need a certain amount of currency to carry them on. And I'll state the obvious thing. The amount of currency you need is, of course, nothing like the total amount of all the transactions, for the very good reason that the same note can be paid to a worker in his pay packet. At the end of 1 week, it goes to a shop. It goes back from the shop to a wholesaler. It goes to a bank. And the same piece of paper, the same note or the same coin, is going round and round and round in the course of a year. For this reason, you see, that the amount of currency needed to carry on buying and selling needn't be anything like the total amount of the transactions themselves. I mean, this is a fairly obvious sort of thing. Now, as a hypothetical case, let us suppose that in the 19th century in this country, the amount of currency needed was £100 million, that's 100 million sovereigns. You'll remember that I said that 100 million sovereigns represented about 25 million ounces of weight of gold, because each sovereign was fixed by law at about 1/4 of an ounce of gold. So you've got this conception in the 19th century, when you did have gold coins circulating as well as other coins, you would have needed, say, 25 million ounces of gold in the coinage to carry on all the transactions of buying and selling. And again, I just remind you that you're still dealing in value. An ounce of gold represents a certain amount of value, that's to say a certain amount of labour required to produce the thing. Alongside the gold, silver and copper coins in the 19th century, you also had circulation of Bank of England notes. The lowest denomination then was £5. You had £5 notes, £10, £20 notes and so on, circulating alongside the other coinage in this country. And it's very important to notice that unlike modern currency, the pound notes you have now, the Bank of England notes were literally as good as gold. And they were as good as gold because by law, Bank of England notes were convertible into gold at the legally fixed rate of about 1/4 of an ounce weight of gold to each sovereign. You could get your gold exchanged for Bank of England notes at that rate, or you could take your Bank of England notes to the Bank of England and get gold at that rate. You could take for £20 and get that amount in its exact equivalent of gold, and there was no, except a very, very minor variation, there was no departure from this, and that is what is meant when you say that the notes were convertible. They were convertible into gold, and the gold was convertible into notes at a legally fixed rate which didn't vary from about 1820 or thereabouts right up to 1914. So now we've dealt with this conception that in order to carry on transactions you need a certain amount of currency. And I said, let us assume that it's £100 million worth, equal to 25 million ounces. Now, with a note issue that was convertible into gold, suppose all of the gold had disappeared from circulation and had been replaced by Bank of England notes. As all those Bank of England notes were convertible into gold, this would have made no difference. If you needed 100 million total, and you took all the metal out of circulation and put Bank of England notes in, you're exactly as you were, you still need 100 million. And as I say, the safeguard is that by law, you could always take your notes and get gold for them. So the currency was always tied to the value of gold. Now jump forward from the 19th century to the situation existing now. Now you have a note issue, pound notes, which are not convertible into anything. You can't go to the Bank of England and demand 5 ounces of gold for £20 notes. You can't go to the Bank of England and demand any amount of gold for £20 notes. In fact, rather off this subject, for most practical purposes, you can't legally hold gold at all. But the essential thing is that the pound note is now not convertible into anything, except itself. I mean, you can take a pound note and get 20 shillings for it or vice versa, but otherwise there's no convertibility. It's an inconvertible paper currency. In other words, the legal link that used to exist between notes and gold has ended completely. Now, if we apply this situation of inconvertible notes to our assumption of 100 million pounds of sovereigns needed to carry on circulation in the 19th century, it's just as if the government then had withdrawn all the gold, made the notes inconvertible, and instead of having 100 million notes circulating, suppose the government had pushed into circulation not 100 million, but 300 million of notes. That is something roughly corresponding to what in fact has happened over the last 30 or 40 years. It would simply have had the effect of making the general price level 3 times as high as it was before. And the reason for this is that given a certain volume of buying and selling transactions, and assuming that the value of the currency needed for those transactions was 25 million ounces of gold, representing a given total amount of labour, if you take away the gold and put 3 times as much paper in its place, the total value represented hasn't altered. This hasn't made any difference whatever to the amount of labour required to produce commodities or the amount of labour required to produce gold or coal or anything else. All that has happened is that you've got 3 times as much of an inconvertible paper currency standing against an unchanged amount of value, an unchanged amount of gold. So each paper note now represents only a third of what it used to represent. Instead of half an ounce of gold representing 10 hours of labour, and therefore being equal in value to one table, you now have half an ounce of gold, which as we know is £2 or 40 shillings, being replaced by £6 or 120 shillings. So you now have one table which was formerly £2, 40 shillings, represented by £6, 120 shillings. Each pound note has had its purchasing power reduced to a third of what it used to be, and the price of a table and everything else has gone up from what it used to be to about 3 times as much. Now, if you look at what really has happened, I'm now using actual real figures, you see what's gone on in the world. If you look at what has happened to currencies since 1938, you will find that the government has increased its note issue by 7 times. It was about 450 million in 1938, and it's now over 3,000 million. You have to make a qualification here. More currency would have been needed in any event. It's impossible to say exactly how much more currency would have been needed, but you get a sort of picture of it if you recognize that the total production, the total physical quantities of goods now being produced each year is about twice what it was in 1938. You might roughly say that you would have needed twice as much currency anyway, because the scale of everything had increased. There were more people, more separate homes, more articles being produced, more articles being bought, and so on. So if you roughly say you would have needed twice as much currency anyway, you're up against this proposition that instead of twice as much, you've got 7 times as much. And as I explained before, and as Marx uses a very similar illustration in Capital, you can say that the government has pushed out nearly 3.5 times as much paper currency as was needed at the old price level of 1938. So that would itself have made the price level about 3.5 times what it was before the war. Actually, the general level of prices now is about 4 times what it was before the war, but you don't expect, of course, absolute mathematical accuracy about these things, and in any event, other things can have intervened to make changes in the value and therefore the price of various commodities. But you get the general picture that you have had the currency depreciated in its value by this pushing out of an excess of inconvertible paper currency. I now want to go back to summarize some of the reasons why prices can change. It is as well for you to bear these in mind. First, I want to remind you that the value of a commodity, commodity itself can go up, leading to a higher price level. The value of a commodity itself can go up because more labour is required to produce it, leading to a higher price level, or it could go down, leading to a lower price level. You will now see, I said earlier, commodities can have their value raised or the value can fall, but you never see, or very, very rarely, see in newspapers anything about the price of anything having come down. Well, now you can see the reason. Superimposed on these relatively minor changes in value and price, you've had this massive depreciation in the purchasing power of money itself. So as the purchasing power of money itself has been depreciated more or less steadily for the last 30 years, so there's been a general rise in the price level, any fall in the value of a commodity just doesn't show up against this general rise. I would remind you, of course, that there is another reason why price can deviate from value, and that is in, so to speak, the ordinary day-to-day fluctuations of supply and demand. All sorts of little things can happen to increase the supply of some commodity in a given market or reduce it, or some changes can take place in the demand, and this also will lead to variations in of price from value. I also mentioned that in times of good trade, there is a tendency for prices to go up, because when trade is very good, the capitalists don't want to hold money, they want to get hold of goods. They're all trying to buy things to expand their factories so the price go up. And when bad trade comes along, the reverse takes place. They're all trying to get hold of money, that's they're all trying to sell goods, and there is a tendency for prices to come down. I now want to come to a practical application of this, which is about wages and prices. And that's that perennial question. It was asked again. I was in an article in the Evening Standard last night. It's always coming up. What causes higher prices? Are higher prices caused by higher wages, or is it higher wages that cause higher prices? Have I got that wrong way round? Yes. Well, you know what it is. I mean, there's one argument which says wages go up because prices have gone up, and the other says prices go up because wages have gone up. Well, the people who ask these questions all assume that one or other must be the true explanation. It doesn't occur to them that both of these statements may be false, or rather, they can both be irrelevant. And if I may give you some sort of example, it is a fact that in summers, when there is a good harvest in the countryside, you also have an unusually large number of townsfolk who visit the country or spend holidays there. Now, people could ask the question, is it the good harvest which causes town people to visit the country, or is it the large number of visitors to the country which causes the corn to grow? And of course the answer is neither. What actually happens is that if you have a very good summer with plenty of sunshine, this makes the corn grow, and it also makes people visit the country. Well, now bringing you back to the wages and prices thing, you have here a fairly good analogy. If you have a massive depreciation of the currency, with everybody counting on prices rising, and to use the sort of phrase, plenty of money about, this is a seller's market, and sellers are able to push up their prices. And of course, wages are also prices. Wages are what the worker gets for selling his labour power. That also is a price. So all you've got is not two problems, but one problem. And that is that if you have massive depreciation of the currency, you have a general rise of prices, and wages and prices go up together, even if it looks as if sometimes one of them appears to cause the other. In the Times on the 19th, a couple of days ago, Professor Phelps-Brown, London University, in a scheme he put forward for dealing with this situation, actually leads in with an explanation almost identical with the one I've given, not the reference to the summer and the harvest, but the statement that if you have a general and continuous rise in prices, then what happens? The workers put in a claim for higher wages. The employer, who back in the 19th century would have resisted this, would have fought it out. Under these present conditions, knowing the prices are going up, he says, oh, well, okay, I couldn't afford to give a 10% increase of wages now, but by the time the stuff I'm producing gets on the market, the price that I'm getting for this stuff will itself have risen by 6 or 7 or 8% during the course of the year. So you get the general inflationary situation enabling wages and prices both to go up. Incidentally, you see, if prices didn't go up, if the seller, the manufacturer, could not count on the price of his commodities going up when they get on the market, and he would have to resist, as far as he could, any demand for higher wages, because the only place that a demand for higher wages could come from would be out of the employer's profit. Whereas you see in an inflationary situation, he doesn't have to face the thing in quite that form. I would now want to read to you, just to show you that this attitude towards it isn't entirely unknown among other people. I want to read to you a couple of paragraphs from the Journal of the First National City Bank of New York, one of the biggest American banks. They're dealing with the reasons for inflation and showing that all the reasons put forward are nearly all of them quite wrong. You have to allow, incidentally, for a certain rather odd use of words. partly it's Americanese and partly it's banker's language. Anyway, I quote, "Because the housewife sees inflation at the end of a long chain of transactions in the supermarket or the department store, she tends to blame greedy middlemen for inflation. Such astigmatism makes many others the target for inflation blame. Commercial banks are blamed for higher interest rates. Unions are blamed for higher wages. Large corporations are blamed for higher prices of their products. And state and local governments are blamed for high property taxes. But most of the blame for inflation is misplaced, for although inflation has 100 faces, it has but one essential cause: overly expansive and erratic monetary policy that has pushed up the quantity of money more swiftly than the quantity of goods and services." In other words, we're back, so to speak, to the Marxian explanation, although these people are not Marxists. They are, of course, bankers, and you can remember the bankers have a sort of vested interest in this. On balance, bankers don't want inflation to take place. It's probably true in the long run that bankers do better with a stable price level. But on this question of trade unions and higher prices, it is worth noticing in passing the inconsistency of the economists and politicians. Many of the economists and politicians, in fact most of them, now blame the trade unions for higher prices. Well, take yourself back to 1921. Prices weren't then rising, they were falling. They were falling for about 10 years continuously. Now, if the economists and politicians at that time had been consistent, they would have been saying, aren't our trade unions marvellous? Look at the way they're bringing down prices. But of course they weren't doing anything of the kind. What they were doing, as always, they were blaming the workers for too many strikes, not working hard enough, not going into productivity deals enough, and so on, just as they are now. But then, of course, they don't have to, neither economists nor politicians have to have long memories. They merely write for the public at the moment and get away with everything. Incidentally, there's something else worth noticing here. If you read press now, anything you like to pick up, the complaint is all the time about the evil of higher prices. And you may think this is a permanent state of affairs, because it isn't. As I say, from 1921 onwards, prices were falling for 10 years. And if you look up what the politicians and the economists were saying then, they would say, what can we do to save ourselves from low prices? Capitalism is being ruined by low prices. How can we get the prices up again? I mean, and if you think that capitalism can't be so inconsistent as this, I assure you that it can, because capitalism is full of contradictions. One other thing I just want to remind you of, that inflation doesn't just happen. Inflation, so to speak, following the lines of the First City National Bank of New York, inflation is perpetrated, so to speak, by the people who control the money supply. If they don't choose to go on increasing the note issue, if they restricted it, they could reverse this situation. They are, of course, rather afraid to do so. I just end, as my time coming, I spoke well over half an hour, to remind you of the great German inflation of the 1920s. At that time, the inflation was going on, it reached fantastic proportions where you were paying 1 million marks for a cup of tea and things like this. And the economists, most of them, were saying, how's this happening? What's going on? I mean, what can we do about it? Well, of course, this didn't just happen. This was engineered by the German government and by the big industrialists in Germany, the Stinners, Krapps and the rest of them, because they were shedding their burden of debts. You see, if you're a government who's got a big national debt, or if you're an industrial firm which has a lot of borrowed money, and you have the currency inflated and you pay the whole lot off in the equivalent of sixpence or something like this, the industrialists were the people who gained. And I know Keynes has argued, the economist Keynes, if you look back historically, this is the general trend of things, that it is the industrialists who got more political power who in the long run gain, that is to say the borrowers gain and the lenders lose in this game of inflation. I would just say the last word though, second last word. I don't know if any of you listened to a Muggeridge program last Sunday night. They were discussing love of money is the root of all evil. And there was a good mixture of Catholics and Protestant clergymen, economists and various other people, and Mr. Muggeridge, and most of them agreed that we live in an affluent society. There was one individual, I don't know what his name was, did intervene to point out that 7% of the population of this country own 84% of the accumulated wealth. Nobody took it up and he didn't pursue it. But if, as they were all agreeing that it's greed that's wrong, this love of money, nobody explained why the greedy workers haven't been able to get their hands on this wealth of the rich. They also had a lady there who was introduced as the wife of a millionaire, who said that she had always had a detached attitude to money. But of course, this is an old game with millionaires. You read any of these interviews with them, they always put up this thing, I'm not really interested in money, it just comes, I like it, and so on. But they're never so detached from it that they actually part with it. Or at least if they did, it would be something, a particular interest. They all agreed, or nearly all of them agreed, that inflation therefore is due to everybody's greed, but they couldn't quite explain why. Galbraith was there, saying that the only remedy for this, he agreed with this proposition generally, the only remedy for it is that you should have prices and wages fixed. Muggeridge threw out some silly statement about, of course, things are different in Russia, that money plays a very different part in Russia, but money doesn't play a different part in Russia, it plays exactly the same sort of part. But what is interesting about this, all these people, the selection of the brains of the community, as it were, not one of them ever even considered the possibility that you could have a social system without a price system, without a wages system, without money, but having production going on solely and directly for consumption, that is, goods being produced simply for being consumed by the population, which is, of course, what the SPGB as socialists stand for. And I end there by just reminding you that we ask people to study economics and understand this sort of thing, but with a very practical purpose, to understand capitalism, to see through the sort of capitalist arguments that are put forward, and see the uselessness of expecting capitalism to be changed by all of these various proposals that people put forward.